I'm Guy Newland, and I'm back with the second of a two-part BBC on grief and Buddhist practice. The day before yesterday, Venerable Chödrön was reading a passage where Tsongkhapa was talking, giving advice to a layperson about the difficulty separating from things that we're strongly attached to, such as our bodies, our wealth, our friends, and by extension we're thinking our spiritual teachers and our family. And I was suggesting yesterday that one element of this stickiness that we have is a kind of identification where we take ourselves, we constitute ourselves psychologically, we hold on to ourselves as the one who has this relationship or this object or this skill or this body. And then the idea of separating it from it is like losing ourselves, because the way we've constituted ourselves in that way. And this certainly, as I was describing yesterday, happened to me. My wife, Valerie Stevens, died of metastatic breast cancer in 2013. She'd been particularly sick for 13 months, and we've been married for 28 and a half years. And I had some very strange psychological states, which I described yesterday. And, you know, at the core of them was, I think, a sense of loss of self. And I would relate that to this idea of, creating a sense of identity that's bound up in that relationship. And I see this in lesser ways in other people around me dealing with Valerie's loss, to the extent that they see me in still existing in an identity with her. And so it's hard for them to sort of see me not in that role. So I think we talk in terms of the middle way here. One extreme is this identification, I am the one who lost my wife, and holding on to that, and thereby making the pain go on longer and be worse than it would otherwise be. The other extreme is to say, I'm not in pain because why? Well, because I'm an American. I'm Donald Trump. We don't have negative feelings. Everything's good. Or it could be because I'm a Buddhist and I've transcended all those worldly things. Or there's various reasons why people have cultures that inculcate in them the need to deny negative feelings that they have, and that this is equally unrealistic as compared to the extreme of identification. So I was thinking that Buddhism is about looking at things realistically so as to avoid needless suffering, and that means avoiding this idea of like making one's core identity the one who suffers, but also at the same time not pretending that one's not suffering when one is. I'm looking at this thing realistically. When people have the idea that it's bad to suffer, so I must not be doing it, then when they end up suffering anyway, as they do, then they suffer worse because they feel bad about feeling bad. And this is quite common, I think, unfortunately, when we lose somebody, and we've been part of that kind of idea. I think when we lose somebody whom we're very close to, as I did, you have this feeling that your world or your heart has wrecked, and you can get a feeling of being isolated or alienated from everybody else. And but then if you start opening up and talking about it, as I did last year, you find that being honest about your own pain is a way to create a deeper connection with other people, because they've all had pain in their lives too. And it struck me when I started thinking about this how it's exactly, or almost exactly, aside from the attaining of arhatship, like the story of Kissa Gotami in the sutras, who had a very, very severe grief experience and was sent to the Buddha to get help. And the Buddha asked her to go get some mustard seed, which is go get some salt, basically, from the house, from a family where no one has died. And as she went around house to house, seeking mustard seed, I'm going to read into the sutra that quite obviously lots of these people told her their stories about their pain. And she was going around looking for a solution to some private hell that she'd collapsed into. And instead, she was like finding through the course of the day that she was having to get her heart pried open wide enough to like look other people in the eye who each had their own pain. And it made me think about how having this sort of experience myself, feeling this sense of hellish alienation, of self-pity or something, being kind of burned away, that it's different from what Sartre said about hell being the other. In our Buddhist practice, others can be irritating, but that irritation is an opportunity to practice. And what hell is when we think we're alone and that we're just sufficient unto ourselves, that we're cut off from others. That's what actually creates this sense of, I'm calling it hellish alienation situation. And it's like actually a delusion, of course, because we're always connected with others. It's something that lots of people have recognized, not just Buddhists. I mean, Thoreau said, not till we have lost our world, not till we have lost everything, do we realize the infinite extent of our relations. And there's a lot of other passages that you can find where people around the world have recognized that it's within the context of loss and then seeing what losses others have as well, that you realize yourself as part of a community and not just in isolation. So we're not really, we don't really have any core separate self. And in the world, there's no essential absolute foundation, and neither in anybody else. So we have a kind of natural intimacy that is possible to get closer to when we're more realistic about things. So the question is, like, how do we then, if we can get to this sense or intimacy, then how do we express it in the way we act toward others in these kinds of situations? And so I just wanted to make a few suggestions in that regard, all very provisional and just based on my experience and not based on research per se in the literature. But one is, I think it's very obvious, like in the Buddhist tradition, we can see that, you have to start by forming an intention to help. A lot of times when we hear about other people's pain, we're like, oh, that's too bad, let me go somewhere else very quickly. And it's not like, oh, all right, well, I am going to try to do something to help. I don't know what it's going to be. Maybe I will fail. But you have to start by having the intention to help, or you're not going to, almost surely. And a lot of the time, it's very noticeable in many cultures that, survivors of serious trauma situations or the family of people who've died recently, they have radiate some death pollution that makes everybody avoid them like they have the plague or something. And really what that is the fear of death, of course. People don't want to look you in the eye when they see you, and it reminds them that, oh, their spouse might just as well have died and definitely will. And that's not something they want to think about, so they just rather not look at you. And this, of course, happens all the time. And so if we're in our practice, we should just recognizing that that's a situation, like, not be part of that, right? Turn toward the people who are suffering rather than turn away from them, for sure. And then what can you do when you turn toward them is you don't know what to do because you don't know exactly who's there. You have to start by knowing that you don't really know exactly the best thing to do in this situation. People want to just get out of the recipe book, what are the words to say? Here's the magic formula. But it wasn't like that with Buddha. He taught different people different things on different days according to what they needed to hear. Being omniscient helped, right? But we don't know for sure, right, what someone needs. So we have to try to pay attention, see if we can get attuned enough to get some insight into what might be and good and might be helpful. And then realize that even so, we're going to make mistakes. And so that's better than not having tried. right? And then you learn, and you can adjust, and maybe the person will appreciate even that you made the effort to try to do something. There's a story that I happened to see in Sogyal Rinpoche's book the other day, where someone asked a man who's dying what he really wants, and he said, "I would like to feel that someone really tried to understand me," which has this interesting presumption that you may very well fail, but at least that someone is trying to understand and make a connection is really important. I think just ending with a couple of things that are a little bit harder to do. For me, it really helped in the beginning and the middle to hear about other people's grief experiences. In the beginning, that meant reading grief memoirs, and later it meant actually talking to people about my pain and hearing about theirs. But those things were both really helpful. Because it normalizes the strange experiences that you have, and then it also, as I was describing, opens your heart up to others and makes you connected to them. It doesn't mean that when someone's grieving you should go over to their house and start telling them about all your misery. So that's the tricky part. But when people can be, say, guided into a grief group or some other situation where they get to be listened to but then also have to listen, it can be really transformative for a lot of people. And then the last thing is, I think the best medicine for a lot of us when anything has us feeling bad, and this is a particularly serious case of that, is to feel that you're effectively able to help others. So there are a few instances when I was in quite bad mental condition last spring, a year ago spring, when people asked me to do things and I was quite irritated with them because didn't they realize that I couldn't think straight and that my wife had just died. But then when I responded to these things by, okay, I'll do what I can, then it not only connected me to other people, but insofar as I was able to help other people, it made me feel a lot better. That's one of the things that there is some research on this, that one of the things that's most helpful to people actually, and fits with Buddha's teachings, is that you get a much more profound sense of happiness out of feeling that you've been effective in helping others. Yeah. And Valerie and I would go for 13 months, we would drive across the state to this cancer clinic, and all day we'd be sitting around waiting in waiting rooms and sitting in the chemo bay, for her getting treatment. And in that context, all these people, large numbers of people together, all, suffering from cancer and their families, there really wasn't any sense of false bravado or illusion. Everybody knew that they were suffering. Nobody was pretending they weren't. Everybody knew they were facing death. Nobody was pretending that death wasn't like a serious consideration. And that made it so that nobody felt alone, because nobody is alone in the first place. But in that situation, because people are being honest about the reality of the world, then you don't feel alone, and you feel like you're connected to others. And I mean, thinking about that in a Buddhist context, just thinking that awakening, the project of awakening, is not a private enterprise. It's something that happens through our relationships with others, if it happens at all, and it happens. So if it has to happen interdependently, it has to happen through our making and knowing that we're making connections and being supported by one another. Thank you.